Welcome everyone to this Zoom presentation on the history of the Upper Goyt Valley. It should last for about 45 minutes and I'll try to answer any questions at the end. This illustration from a popular postcard of the early 1900s shows the hamlet of Goyt's Bridge, with the Goyt flowing under some large stepping stones on the right and the picturesque Packhorse Bridge spanning Wild Moorstone Brook on the left. This whole area now lies beneath the southern end of Irwood Reservoir. This Google Earth image shows the southern end of the valley, with the outskirts of Buxton in view just a mile or so to the east. Macclesfield is about 10 miles to the west. Zooming into the image shows the famous Cat and Fiddle Inn on the left and the small car park at Derbyshire Bridge at bottom right. I'll be using this old Ordnance Survey map from the early 1900s to point out various historical features along the valley. Our journey starts at the Cat and Fiddle pub, perched high on the horizon on this old postcard. It lay close to the junction of both the old and new turnpike roads between Buxton and Macclesfield. Some of the slopes on the old road, to the right on the postcard, proved too steep for the increasingly large wagons, and it was replaced by the present A537 in 1823. The Goyt rises on Axe Edge, emerging beside the old road, before flowing north along the valley, eventually merging with the River Mersey near Stockport. Its name is said to derive from the Old English word for a stream, G-O-T-E. There are many old postcards of the Cat and Fiddle on the Goyt Valley website. It was a very popular starting point for what was described as one of the loveliest drives in Derbyshire, following the Goyt north through the valley and returning to Buxton along the Long Hill Road. For many years it boasted being the highest pub in England, standing some 1,690 feet above sea level, until someone discovered the Tan Hill pub in Cumbria was 42 feet higher. These old postcards reveal such a lot of fascinating detail, from the top-hatted gents by the pub door to the young boy sat on the running plate of his dad's smart motor car. There's an early motorcycle next to a horse and carriage, all of them posing for the camera before setting off on their various journeys. In this photo, the coach driver has crammed as many people as possible onto what looks more like a cart than a carriage. There are various suggestions on how the pub got its famous name. I always assumed it came from the old poem Hey Diddle Diddle, but some think it's a corruption of La Chasse Fidèle, French for the faithful cat. The stone carving of the fiddle-playing cat above the door was moved to the new porch many years ago. After standing empty and forlorn for some time, it is good to know that this famous landmark is now back in business. A short distance from the Cat and Fiddle Inn lay 4 fairly substantial houses, but there are very few signs of them left on the ground today. This rare photo shows all 4 alongside the old turnpike as it snakes back towards Buxton over the horizon. Marchington Farm, Moss House, Moss Hall and Goyt's Moss Farm. They were all demolished, along with more than 25 other properties, including Irwood Hall further north, following Stockport Corporation's purchase of the estate to build the twin reservoirs in 1930. This followed the death of the last of the Grimshaw family that had owned the 2,010-acre Irwood estate since the early 1830s. Mary Grimshaw died a widow and without children and had already come to an agreement to release the land to the corporation on her death. This is Moss House. The 1911 census records that John and Eliza Swindles lived here. It must have been a very hard existence, especially during harsh winters, although John looks like he's enjoying a well-deserved rest here. Here's another picture of John outside Moss House with his wife Eliza. There's no record of the young girl in the census returns, so perhaps she was just visiting at the time. Maybe a granddaughter. The furthest house along the lane was Goyt's Moss Farm, shown in these watercolour paintings during the summer and winter of 1911. Today, it would stand slightly beyond the Peak District Ranger's hut. I found this photo of the farmhouse looking in a very sorry state in an old album from the early 1960s. It looks as though it was the last to be demolished, as there's no sign of the others. On the other side of the lane is an outcrop of black shale. This is perhaps a clue to an industry that once dominated this part of the Goyt Valley, coal mining. Fading back to the Google Earth image shows the area today. And zooming in, it's just possible to make out a number of small dots and a network of lines on the ground. This diagram comes from John Barnett's detailed archaeological survey of the valley, recorded in 1994, and shows just how extensive the coal workings were back in the 18th and 19th centuries. There are two coal seams in the area. The one closest to the surface is the Goyt seam. The deeper one is the ringing low. The cross-section below gives an idea of how one seam lies above the other. The mine has naturally targeted the Goyt seam first, simply by digging a series of pits across the landscape. As well as surface pits, the ringing low seam was also accessed by mining horizontal levels all the way from the outskirts of Buxton, a distance of well over a mile. As the surface pits got deeper, the miners used two types of horse-powered winch to access the coal: the cog and rung gin, and later the more efficient whim gin. Both gins left distinctive marks on the ground, depending on whether the circle compacted by the horse centred around the shaft or to the side. This fine painting is part of Buxton Museum's collection. It's not the Goyt's Moss Colliery, but it shows a good example of a whim gin in the background. The coal was too poor quality to burn domestically, but it was ideal to fuel the Duke of Devonshire's lime kilns on the nearby slopes of Grinlow, just below Buxton Solomon's Temple today. The colliery was formally closed in 1893, the reason being area above water level worked out. For anyone interested in the story of coal mining in the Goyt, I'd highly recommend Alan Roberts and John Leach's The Coal Mines of Buxton. Travelling north from Goyt's Moss, alongside the Goyt, we soon come to a small bridge. This ancient crossing point is the real Derbyshire Bridge. At one time the Goyt marked the boundary between Cheshire to the west and Derbyshire to the east, so journeying south, travellers would have crossed from Cheshire into Derbyshire. You can still see the faint tracks coming down to the bridge from both sides of the valley, which probably date back to ancient packhorse routes. This old postcard view shows a group of tourists in a horse-drawn carriage heading up the valley from the bridge. A short distance further from the bridge is a sluice across the Goyt. This once fed water along a narrow mill lade to a giant water wheel, said to be the second largest in Britain, which powered the millstones at Goyt's Clough Mill. The lade is very overgrown and not easy to find, and when you do, it seems as though the water would have had to defy the force of gravity by running up the slope. But appearances can be deceptive, and there is a gradual fall as it snakes across the valley side. The blue line shows the fade as it feeds the small reservoir above where the mill wheel would once have stood. This earlier map gives a better impression of the various mill buildings. The small reservoir is still there at the top of the slope, but very overgrown. From here, the water would have been fed to the giant water wheel, which is said to have been 36 feet in diameter. The mill had a long history. Its original use was to grind the surface of stones from the nearby quarry to create paving slabs. It's thought that Pickford's, of removals fame, started his career here in the early 1700s, transporting them by long packhorse trains, some of which were said to have paved London's Regent Street. A visitor in 1857 said the mill had been disused for many years, but was about to reopen as a mill to grind cork from a nearby quarry at Ladmanlow to create barite, and mineral used in the production of white paint. This lasted until 1890, when the mill closed for the final time, and the buildings lay derelict for many years. Just beside the mill was a line of mill workers' cottages. This wonderful postcard shows 3 children standing behind the cottages. The main mill buildings, including the water wheel, would have been behind them to the right, against the rock face. This photo was taken looking south from Goyt's Club Quarry, along the lane back to Derbyshire Bridge. The derelict mill buildings are circled on the left, and the mill workers' cottages to the right. This photo shows the mill cottages in the early 1930s from the front. I've seen a similar photo showing a no tease sign outside. I think they must have got fed up with people asking. Further up the slope behind the mill lay Goyt's Clough Farm. Today there are only a few stones left on the ground to show it ever existed, hidden amongst the trees. Just a short distance north of the mill lay the large stone quarry, which must date back many centuries. It's at top left on both the map and this old postcard. Today it's difficult to see many signs of what would have been a busy and noisy place, apart from the open ground beside the road where pack horses and carts would have been loaded with stone, which is now a popular spot for picnics and parking, and the large boulders of waste which cover the side of the valley down towards the Goyt. The small packhorse bridge, which once lay in the heart of Goyt's Bridge, a mile or so to the north, was moved to span the Goyt near Goyt Clough in 1965, during the final stages of the construction of Irwood Reservoir. This is an aerial view of the southern end of Irwood Reservoir today. Irwood Car Park is at bottom left, just below the modern bridge. Fading in the old map shows where Goyt's Bridge once lay. The dashed line shows the lane from Goyt's Clough. The road had to be moved slightly to the west during the construction of the reservoir. This photo was taken here and would have been the first view of Goyt's Bridge approaching from the south, with the Goyt on the right and Goyt's Bridge Farm on the opposite side of the valley. As we enter Goyt's Bridge, the Packhorse Bridge is on the right, spanning Wild Moorstone Brook. To reach the bridge, visitors would have had to cross a series of large stepping stones over the Goyt, which must have been quite treacherous when the river was in full flow. This attractive photo shows a couple of children on the stepping stones, with the Packhorse Bridge behind on the left. The 2 buildings in the background are farm barns. This view is taken looking north from the Packhorse Bridge. It's the only image I've seen showing a small footbridge, which it must have provided a far safer crossing when the Goyt was running fast or the stones wet and slippery. The lane from Goyt's Bridge runs across from the left. A small one-room village school run by the Grimshaws for local children is in the background, and in the centre of the photo is a gypsy caravan which appears in many postcard views. I think it may have been used as an ice cream kiosk for some years, although this is one of a series of photos taken around 1930 showing it being used by holidaymakers. There are only 3 houses in Goyt's Bridge, 2 farmhouses either side of the Packhorse Bridge, Goyt's Head to the west and Goyt's Bridge to the east. The grandest house was Irwood Cottage, with a school in the garden. The nearby buildings were barns. And there was another larger bridge across the Goyt, just to the north, known as Irwood Bridge. So it was possible to make a complete circuit around the hamlet by crossing both bridges. This grainy cinefilm was taken in 1932, shortly before all the buildings in Goyt's Bridge were demolished. It includes a view of the Packhorse Bridge with Goyt's Head Farm in the background, taken from the other side of the bridge, close to Goyt's Bridge Farm. The well-dressed family are crossing the stepping stones towards the Packhorse Bridge. There are also glimpses of the gypsy caravan with a school in the background and Irwood Cottage with the stepping stones in the foreground. This attractive painting of Goyt's Bridge is taken looking south across the stepping stones with the Packhorse Bridge on the left and Goyt's Head Farm with its distinctive porch at top right. The two buildings in the centre, either side of the lane, were barns. This illustration features on the cover of Gerald Hancock's wonderful little book, Goyt Valley Romance, which was very much the inspiration for my interest in the history of the valley. Both farmhouses sold teas to the many visitors who flocked here. Here, a large family enjoy high tea in the garden outside Goyt's Head Farm, with a porch behind them. And just visible in the background is Irwood Cottage, further along the lane. Crossing the Packhorse Bridge brings us to Goyt's Bridge Farm, which stood beside the lane leading from the Buxton to Whaley Bridge Long Hill Road, which curves around from the bottom right. Today it's known as Old Goyt's Lane, but it used to be called Sandy Lane. It was the main route into Goyt's Bridge before the Bunsell Incline was tarmacked in 1967. Today, the lane vanishes into the waters of the reservoir. A cafe sign hangs above the entrance to Goyt's Bridge Farm, with Sandy Lane sloping down at bottom right of the photo. This is said to be the French chef from Irwood Hall with 3 of his staff, so it looks like they serve some fine food here on special occasions. Continuing the circuit of the hamlet brings us to the main bridge across the river, wide and strong enough to take both horses and carts, as well as cars in later years. This is a view of the bridge from the lane, with Irwood Cottage on the far left. This shows the bridge from the other side of the Goyt, looking north, and must have been taken in the early 1900s, if not before. Irwood Cottage is just out of frame to the left. This photo was taken from a similar position, but in the 1960s. By this time, Irwood Cottage had long since been demolished. Stockport Corporation did attempt to sell the bridge, but there were no takers, so it sank beneath the waters of Irwood Reservoir when it was flooded in 1968, although it has been known to surface very occasionally when the water level drops during severe droughts. This photo was taken in August 1984. Irwood Cottage was the largest house in Goyt's Bridge and seems to have been divided into 2 properties. Gardener's Cottage on the left with a large greenhouse and vegetable garden, and the gatehouse to the right, which stood alongside the entrance drive to Irwood Hall. The Grimshaw's head butler, Ignatius Oisabel, lived here with his family for a time. His wife also taught at the small one-room school in the garden behind the house. This is one of a series of photos of what seems to have been an annual shooting party for the Grimshaw's family and friends. It was taken in front of the cottage in 1882. The chap on the far right with the felt hat and pipe is Francis Upton Gaskell, Samuel Grimshaw's nephew and cousin to his 2 daughters, Mary and Genevieve. The only other person I can identify is the man taking pride of place in the centre, Lord Belper, described in Wikipedia as a courtier and politician. There were 2 large, well-built barns on the slopes behind the house. One of them is clearly visible in the background, as shown on the map here. The small single-room school lay on the other side of the drive to Irwood Hall, in the garden behind Irwood Cottage and close to Shooter's Clough, the stream that flowed alongside the drive. This photo shows Shooter's Clough in full flow with the schoolhouse to the right. And here are 22 school children, pictured outside the school in the 1920s. It was obviously a fairly basic construction, and I'd guess the level of schooling was also fairly basic. The only person we can identify is a tall lad at the back, said to be Joe Hewitt, son of the manager of the nearby Castedge coal mine. His tall stature was said to have helped him escape lessons by acting as footman on the Grimshaw's carriage when it was sent to meet their guests from either Whaley Bridge or Buxton Station. The school was started on the suggestion of Miss Dolores, a Spanish companion to Mrs. Grimshaw in the late 1900s. St. Joseph's Shrine, a mile or so to the northwest, is dedicated to her. The green arrow shows where this photo was taken, looking down from the western side of the valley towards Goyt's Bridge, with the twin barns on the right. Below them is Irwood Cottage. To the left of the cottage, hidden in the dip, is Irwood Bridge, with a Goyt running from right to left, also out of view. Sandy Lane snakes down on the opposite side of the valley, with Goyt's Bridge Farm here. You can just make out the lane running from the farm, diagonally left to the bridge. The gates guarding the drive up to Irwood Hall are just visible here. This is a view from the opposite side of the valley, taken from close to the Bunsell Incline, the road that today slopes down from Long Hill to the main car parks. From the left, this is Goyt's Head Farm with the Packhorse Bridge just below. The Goyt runs from left to right along the valley floor. The gypsy caravan is just visible here. I'm not sure what this small building was, probably just a large shed. The two small arches allowed Shooter's Clough to flow under the road and into the Goyt. Here's another wonderful photo showing the shooting party, posing on the side of this small bridge in 1883. This was taken during a severe flood, with water from Shooter's Clough overflowing down the side of the valley between the shed and the bridge. I think this may have been the flood of 1930, which marked the end of the small coal pit at Cast Edge, which lay beside Shooter's Clough, close to Irwood Hall. Irwood Bridge is here, hidden behind the slope and the trees. Irwood Cottage is on the right, alongside the gates up to Irwood Hall. And the roof line of Irwood Hall is just visible in the background, amongst the trees. This wonderfully detailed postcard illustration shows the view looking south from the bridge. Above the twin arches over Shooter's Clough, a small black dog bounds up to a lady dressed in black. The gypsy caravan is on the right, with white hens scratching in the garden of Goyt's Head Farm behind. A figure can just be seen outside the farmhouse porch, chatting to someone walking past the Packhorse Bridge at far left. The Goyt flows over the stepping stones to join Wild Moorstone Brook, with a lane from Goyt's Clough winding in from far right. This is one of my favourite photos, showing a group of Grimshaw servants and estate workers posing in front of the gates beside Irwood Cottage in 1880, with the large twin barns just visible in the background. Here's the route, from the gates along the drive towards the hall. Fading in today's satellite view reveals how the drive now runs under the modern bridge, just north of Irwood Hall car park. It's often possible to see signs of the old road when the water level under the bridge drops. I've managed to find a couple of photos of the drive, both taken close to Irwood Hall. The first was taken here, with Shooter's Clough on the right. It's just possible to make out a lady in Victorian dress, sitting by the bank. The second was taken slightly closer to the hall, but looking back towards Goyt's Bridge. It shows the junction of the drive and a path leading up the slope to the right. This is the same scene today. The path on the right is the one which now leads back to Irwood Hall car park. The old drive is completely hidden amongst the undergrowth. Quite a difference. I always find the ruins of Irwood Hall an evocative but somewhat depressing sight, even more so when you see what a fine country house it was in its prime, with magnificent views over the Goyt Valley. The central arch was a door through to the south-facing formal gardens. This photo shows the door open, and it's just possible to make out some of the interior furnishings. The faint outlines of the borders can still be seen on the ground today, as well as some of the curved stones which must once have surrounded the fountain. This is one of the architect's original drawings, probably from the early 1830s. And this is one of his earlier sketches, showing a very grand Italianate-style chapel to the left. Samuel Grimshaw obviously felt this was a step too far. In the end, the family's chapel was created in the top-storey turret at the front of the house. This rare photo shows the interior of the chapel, furnished in typically Catholic style. A light was said to have been left in the window, which could be seen throughout the valley. Here we see a group of the Grimshaw staff and servants pictured outside the hall just after the turn of the century. Mr. Wiles at far left was butler, and his wife, seated at the front in black, was housekeeper. At the far end of the garden stands a series of steps which lead up to the Grimshaw's hilltop cemetery. This photo shows how they once looked, under a magnificent arch topped with a G for Grimshaw. And this is Captain Preston, posing on the steps. He married the younger of the two Grimshaw sisters, Genevieve, in 1891. He died just 10 years later and is now buried in the family cemetery. It's a short walk up the slope from the steps to the Grimshaw cemetery. The building marked on the map as a vault has long since gone, and the graves below ground have been well sealed, but the memorials on the right remain. The largest one, set higher than the others, is dedicated to Grimshaw family members, including the head of the family, Samuel, his wife Jessie, and their 1-year-old son Arthur, as well as their 2 daughters, Mary and Genevieve, and their husbands, Captain Preston and Helier Gosselin. The 6 crosses to the right are dedicated to some of the family's special friends and servants. I'm not sure whether their coffins also lie in the vault or are buried underneath. The central one at the back commemorates John Butler and his young wife Hannah. He was captain of the family's ocean-going yacht, the Mariquita. Coming down from the cemetery to the foot of the slope lies a large pile of dressed stone. This is all that remains of Castedge farmhouse, one of 2 attractive houses to the west of the hall, separated by a large walled vegetable garden. This photo of Castedge was taken with the vegetable garden on the right and the slope up to the cemetery in the background. There was a spring in the wall just here, beside the entrance to Castedge. This photo shows Kathleen Nell, daughter of the Castedge farmer, gathering water from the spring. And in the background is the other house, Shooter's Clough Cottage, which was home to the manager of the nearby coal mine. Fading in today's satellite view shows the spring still in the wall. Turning down the track from Castedge soon brings us to the impressive back gates to Irwood Hall. On the opposite side of the lane lay Castedge coal mine. The coal was far better quality than at Goyt's Moss, but produced in much smaller quantities, so must have just supplied the hall and other houses on the estate. This is mine manager Jack Hewitt at far left with his daughter Phyllis in 1922. The mine extended for about 700 yards into the hillside, and Jack often took visitors on tours of the workings, although I'd have thought that it had been a fairly dirty and difficult trip, especially for ladies in long dresses. The entrance has long since been blocked off and is well hidden, so there's very little evidence it ever existed, apart from a few broken walls. It never recovered from a flash flood along Shooter's Clough in 1930 that destroyed much of the buildings and machinery. This shows the mine buildings following the deluge and the devastation it caused. It was finally forced to close in 1933. For anyone interested in the history of the mine, there's an excellent little book by Kevin Dranfield called Goyt Valley Miner. Exiting the gates at Irwood Cottage, there was a choice of roads on the left. The path through the valley followed the Goyt north towards Ferny Lee. To the far left is the street, marked on maps as a Roman road and also known as Embridge Causeway. This leads to Rayno and then Macclesfield via Pimchair and was an important route for packhorse trains carrying salt from the Cheshire Brines. Fading in today's satellite view shows how both roads were submerged when Irwood Reservoir was flooded in the mid-1960s. Here's the main car park today, alongside the street. At the top centre of the image is the southern tip of Ferny Lee Reservoir. Before Irwood was flooded, Ferny Lee extended further south. The circle on this map from the 1930s shows a footbridge across Ferny Lee, but it was far grander than the average footbridge. It was built fairly close to an old ford across the Goyt. As part of her negotiations with Stockport Corporation, Mary Grimshaw insisted they create a way for locals to cross from one side to the other once Fernley had been flooded. It was demolished in the 1960s during the building of Irwood, as the road between the reservoirs meant there was no longer any need for it. Judging by the construction work behind this well-dressed gent, I think it'd be fairly soon after the photo was taken. Two farmhouses lay either side of the old ford across the Goyt, Irwood and Bunsell. This is Irwood. Samuel Grimshaw is said to have stayed here during the construction of the hall, sometime around 1840. Nothing now remains beyond a few bumps and hollows close to the track leading down from the car park to the shore of Fernley Reservoir. This is a view across from the other side of the valley, with Bunsell Farm at bottom right and Irwood at top left. It's also just possible to make out the ford across the Goyt, with a footpath sloping up the other side. The horizontal track is a road between Goyt's Bridge to Fernley, which is now the footpath along the western shore of Fernley Reservoir. The farmers at Bunsell, Joe and Prudence Hibbert, were the last to leave the valley, packing up their belongings and moving with their sheep to Parsley Hay in March 1936. A local journalist sent to interview the couple recorded Joe's words. "We can't stay here for much longer, that I know. 2 of my ewes were in the water last Sunday, and I'm feared for the young lambs. Besides, the corporation have said we must go, and there's no arguing with corporations. They aren't human folk. Corporations are like Providence. You can't set your hands or eyes on them." Bunsell Farm lay at the foot of the Bunsell Incline, a long straight slope into the valley from the Long Hill Road, which was once part of the Cromford and High Peak Railway. A plaque near the bottom explains there was only tarmacked in 1967, following the completion of Irwood Reservoir. It was one of the longest of 6 inclines along the 33-mile route, an incredible feat of Victorian engineering that connected important canals in Cromford and Whaley Bridge and was completed in 1831. There's lots of information on the Goyt Valley website about the railway. It came into the valley from Ladmanlow on the outskirts of Buxton through the longest tunnel on the route. Trains were hauled up and down these steep slopes using steam-driven pulleys. This photo was taken closer to Cromford on the Middleton incline. When it was first opened, wagons were pulled along the level sections of track by horses, but they were soon replaced by small steam locomotives. A small reservoir on the left, as you come down from Long Hill, once supplied water to these engines. There was another, about halfway down on the right, shown here on the map. This is completely overgrown today. The section from Ladmanlow to Whaley Bridge through the valley was abandoned in 1892 when an easier route was opened via Buxton without the need to haul trains up and down such steep inclines. For the next 70 years, the track seems to have been left abandoned. This view is taken looking up the incline from beside the second reservoir, which is just out of frame to the left. I think it may have been some kind of engine house on the right, but I'm not sure. It looks like it had been derelict for many years when the photo was taken, and there's no sign of it today. This photo was taken from around the same position, but looking down the slope. There's a bridge over the track in the background. It's still there, if you know where to look. Here's another of the same bridge, again looking south, but taken in the 1960s during the construction of Irwood Reservoir. The bridge is still intact, but fairly well hidden. The easiest way to find it is to walk down the shortcut from the small car park at the foot of the Bunsell Incline towards Fernley Reservoir and look over the wire fence on the right. Here's a close-up of the old map showing the bridge. Fading in today's satellite view gives a better idea of where it now lies, below the car park. The railway track continued under the bridge. Today's road sweeps around the left and over the dam between the two reservoirs. I've highlighted the old track and the road to make it easier to see where they split. The narrower path running vertically on the left rejoins the abandoned railway track, which now provides a popular footpath running along the eastern shore of the reservoir. The track to the bridge descended into the valley from the Long Hill Road. After crossing the bridge, it passed behind Bunsell Farm to reach the ford, and then up the other side to rejoin the road running north from Goyt's Bridge to Ferney-Lee. Owood Farm is just visible at top left. There were 3 farmhouses within a short distance of each other on this side of the valley, before the lanes snaked down to cross the Goyt: Intake, Stubbin and Masters. This photo was taken from the other side of the valley and shows Intake in the far distance. The lane between Goyt's Bridge and Ferney-Lee crosses from left to right, with the Goyt just below and the disused railway liners at bottom right. So this gives a good idea of the water level today. The old railway line along the eastern shore and the track bordering the western shore. It's difficult to find any remains of Intake today, apart from a few dressed stones hidden amongst the undergrowth. The ruins of Stubbin lie at the junction of 2 footpaths, as the shoreline path rises to meet what's known as the woodland path. Masters Farm lay to the left of the lane as it snaked down past Ferney-Lee gunpowder mill to cross the Goyt over a small stone bridge. Fading in today's satellite view shows where this attractive farmhouse now lies, beneath the waters of the reservoir. One other place of interest on this section are a couple of stone gateposts that stand on the opposite bank of the reservoir. Fading back to the map shows they once stood either side of a track that led down to the bridge over the Goyt, so would have been used by workers travelling to and from the gunpowder mill. I think the building just below the gatepost must have been the gunpowder magazine, as it's as far from the works as possible, in case of accidental explosions. This map is just slightly north of the previous one, and shows the extent of Ferney-Lee gunpowder mill. The arrow shows where the photographer would have been standing, close to the disused railway track. The Goyt is just out of view at the bottom of the photo. Established in 1801, at its peak, the mill employed well over 100 men. It was a perfect spot for a gunpowder mill, with the Goyt providing water to the millstones which ground down the ingredients to produce the explosive powder, and remote enough from nearby houses in the event of the inevitable accidental explosions. Having said that, an explosion in 1836 blew George Heaps some 600 yards into the garden of Masters Farm. The Macclesfield Courier reported that he was, of course, quite dead when found. Here's a group of workers with their fire engine, not the safest of jobs in a gunpowder mill. I don't know, but I would guess that the buildings in the background, with thick stone walls between them and wooden fronts and roofs, would have been designed to minimise damage caused by accidental explosions. Joyce Winfield has written a fascinating book on the history of the mill for anyone interested in discovering more. It includes details about some of the many accidents that occurred here over the years, including one in 1909 that killed 3 workers, 2 of them circled in this photo, George Raven on the left and Joe Hill on the right. The mill closed in 1921, following the development of explosives that were safer to produce and far more powerful, such as dynamite, TNT and nitroglycerine. For the next 10 years, it lay derelict and forgotten. This film was taken in 1932, during the inauguration ceremony for the construction of Ferney-Lee Reservoir. It was taken at the same time as the one of Goyt's Bridge, and again the full version is on the Goyt Valley website. The work was already well underway by the time of the ceremony, with the Goyt just managing to struggle through the site. It includes some fascinating detail, showing steam-driven cranes, as well as one of the small steam engines that transported materials around the site. The farmer leading his sheep through the construction site is George Brocklehurst, father of Bill, who has been a great help identifying various places throughout the valley from old photos. This aerial view, again taken in 1932, shows the northern end of the site, with a road from Goyt's Bridge snaking in from bottom left, past Masters Farm. Some of the ruins of the gunpowder mill are still visible. The stone bridge over the Goyt is here, close to the entrance to the mill. There are 2 roads running north from the other side of the bridge. The one to the left is known as the Valentine and leads up to Ferney-Lee and the Long Hill Road. In the far distance, further along the Valentine, it's possible to make out the temporary housing for the construction navvies. This photo shows a group of workers in one of the huts that served as a pub. The road from the bridge to the right leads up to Shore-style Farm. There's very little left of the farmhouses and buildings today. And at bottom right is a disused track of the Cromford and High Peak Railway. The green line shows the Valentine rising up from the small bridge to meet the Long Hill Road, with a disused railway track marked in brown. There were 3 houses to the north of the gunpowder mill on this side of the Goyt: the Hollows, Lower Lodge and Upper Lodge. Fading in the aerial view shows where they once lay in relation to today's landscape, with Fernley Reservoir at the bottom and the Long Hill Road between Buxton and Whaley Bridge on the right. The Hollows lay closest to the Goyt. A sign on the gate shows that it served teas to visitors. Below is the same house a couple of years later, now engulfed by a busy construction site. The house at the railway crossing was known as Lower Lodge. I think it must have been home to the level crossing keeper up to 1892, when this section of the track was abandoned. And I think the faint black line over the track beside the house must be a level crossing barrier. You can just make out the track running across the centre of the top photo with the Valentine behind. In the bottom photo, the Valentine is in the foreground running down the slope. The railway track is hidden behind the trees and hedge to the left. It's still possible to see where the old railway track heads north, close to the small car park at the northern end of Fernley. It will be wonderful to open the track as a walking and cycling route, much like the Monsell Trail, but a long section from here through to Fernley lies on private land, so it wouldn't be simple. At the top of the slope on the left, where the Valentine meets Long Hill, lay Upper Lodge, an attractive house which I think may once have been a shop, but which has completely vanished from the landscape. From here, it's just a short trip back to Buxton along Long Hill. I hope you enjoyed this brief history of the Goyt Valley. There's lots more information and photos, as well as a wide selection of wonderful walks on the website at www.goyt-valley.org.uk. I'll now end the presentation and we'll be happy to answer any questions anyone may have.